In 2024, Dr. Chris Kempshall published the book, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, which explores some of the more difficult and complex concepts of the Star Wars lore in a very unique storytelling lens. Rise and Fall attempts to view the ins and outs of the Galactic Empire from a historical finding point of view. In reading books like this, you are able to make connections between the political commentary in Star Wars and real-life history and current events, like what's currently happening around the world in places like Gaza and the Congo. An alternative title for this book really could have been Star Wars, A History from a Certain Point of View. It shows how history can look much differently when viewed from a certain point of view. The author is an actual World War I historian, so you can see how he draws parallels to real history through careful storytelling, and all while keeping it very much a Star Wars story. This is a prime example of how through fiction you can learn the concepts of real history, so when you do learn the real history, you are able to make those connections much easier. Or even better, it can illuminate what you already know about history. You can even see glimpses of real historical people, like Bonhoeffer, through the complexities of the characters presented in this book. Even looking at the show Andor, you can see characters such as Senator Dasi Iran being arrested for vocalizing discontentment over the Gorman massacre, which mirrors how vocal critics against the statehood takeover were imprisoned by authoritarian dictators like Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Franco, or Mao Zedong. Chris Kempshall wrote a synopsis of the book on his website saying, "When Palpatine declared the birth of his new empire, he expected it would stand for 10,000 years. Instead, it lasted only 24. This is a story of how a tyrannical regime rose from the ashes of democracy, ruled the galaxy with an iron fist, and then collapsed into dust. It is a story of war and heroes, of the power of propaganda, and the dangers of complacency. But most of all, it is a story of ordinary people trying to live their lives in the face of a brutal dictatorship." Rise and Fall's unique storytelling showcases the galactic history from the rise of Sheev Palpatine into divine galactic emperorship, to the defeat of both the re-emerged Palpatine and the First Order, all through the lens of a retired resistance fighter turned historian just trying to make sense of what happened in history to get to where they did. The narrator mentions that the First Order didn't happen in isolation, that they did not simply manifest into existence of their own accord. He mentions that if they could wait 30 more years before trying to re-establish what had once fallen, then so can another offshoot of patient neo-imperials. He goes on to say that to guard against the return of the Empire in yet another form, we must start the whole process of learning about it once again. So here we are, learning once again about the Empire. Palpatine, to some, had been a beloved wartime hero, and as such, had his life threatened on several occasions. As far as assassination attempts, history has shown how perceived violence against a leader may actually garner favor for that leader from the public. In Palpatine's case, he was now a man who had won a war and, by his own statements, brought peace to the galaxy. Many in the Senate cheered him on as they unassumingly weren't bothered with the idea of him being emperor. Examples of how surviving violence in our reality shaped public perception might be how Jair Bolsonaro was critically injured during a campaign event and his polls increased as he went on to win his election. Narendra Modi survived a bomb attack which boosted his popularity and he went on to win his election. Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt which bolstered his polls, allowing him to win the upcoming election. You can also look at examples of Teddy Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan, who both got shot and won by a landslide. Violence can also be a tool to garner support against a perceived enemy. It's a cornerstone of empire policy to use horrible events to justify even more horrible responses. Look no further than Israel's logic towards the operation in October of 2023. Nothing justifies October 7th, but October 7th justifies everything. Kempshall writes in his book about how the end of the Clone Wars had left the Empire in possession of weapons and military material from the defeated Separatists. While these weapons and material were becoming outdated technology, the Empire had other value for them. High-ranking Imperial officials would have these items smuggled onto worlds in order to justify defense against assumed future potential threats. The Empire also found value in deporting unfavorable citizens from worlds they wished to exploit to worlds in the outer regions, which created what's known as Tarkin towns. These factions of displaced people would sow division and animosity, even violence, with the indigenous peoples over the limited resources. In our history, there are examples of how the colonizing nations have, by proxy, funded or supported what they deem as terrorist organizations in order to undermine a population of people or a governing entity. A good example would be Israel funding Hamas or America funding ISIS. When violence inevitably happens as a result of these shadow alliances, the Empire is able to then dust off their hands and claim innocence, or even justify military involvement. Generally, when it comes to authoritarian takeovers, events of violence can be huge catalysts. Another good example is the Reichstag fire. Political leaders use crises like these to advance their own goals. What really matters is how events will be used and what narratives are spun from them. In Palpatine's case, he had been abducted, held hostage, and survived multiple assassination attempts, which created an image of strength and power in the eyes of the general public. Once in power, Palpatine worked to revise history to paint himself in a better light. I'm sure you've heard some form of the phrase, "History is written by the victors." Mon Mothma had once explained to Princess Leia that the people of the galaxy know Palpatine is corrupt and cruel. They've known that for a generation. It didn't stop Palpatine from attempting to rewrite history to present a more acceptable version of himself. One could presume that he enjoyed the power of ruling the galaxy, but there also appears to be a significant part of Palpatine that wanted those who feared him to also, on some level, love him. Whether or not this need for love was genuine, generating love for leader is a common propaganda tactic authoritarian rulers utilize. For instance, in ancient kingdoms such as Mesopotamia, leaders such as Nebuchadnezzar would be exemplified by statues and paintings. Mao Zedong's massive portrait is prominently hung in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, to symbolize his authority and regime ideology, and has been up since 1949, despite being dead for almost 50 years. In Pyongyang, North Korea, there are large portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, the great leader and the dear leader respectively, overlooking the plaza at all times. And there's plenty of iconography of the current leader, Kim Jong-un, all throughout the country, including in people's homes. Joseph Stalin would regularly have his portraits displayed in public and during parades. In the Dominican Republic, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo had his image hung in public spaces and official buildings, and also would require Dominicans to display pictures of him in their homes. Adolf Hitler's likeness was routinely used in propaganda and public spaces. Saddam Hussein commissioned thousands of portraits of himself, placing them in every school, airport, and office in Iraq. In our present day in Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi displays his portrait on billboards and banners, hanging on buildings and along roads. In Iran, the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, showcases an abundance of murals, posters, and portraits, and is often set alongside the country's later leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, which are up at mosques and shopping malls and on the sides of buildings. In Russia and surrounding regions, Vladimir Putin's image is widely and prominently displayed in public buildings, schools, offices, and religious venues in the form of public street art, murals, framed portraits, and souvenirs. His portraits even dominate the public space in Chechnya. Speaking of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko's likeness is prominently on display in a similar way that Putin's image is. We are now even seeing large public displays of Trump in America, like that of the 30-foot banner on the facade of the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA. Displaying the leader's image is a key aspect of building a personality cult, aiming to instill reverence and loyalty among the population. In a dictatorship or kingdom, the leader embodies the regime. Loving the leader is likened to loving the dictatorship. To do so, people's hearts and minds have to be won over. Population control relies on propaganda, and propaganda relies on visual stimuli that make you apt to agree to it. The images serve as powerful propaganda tools, reinforcing the leader's image and promoting the regime's ideology. Basically, it's like advertising for your regime, and to some degree, it works. The presence of the leader's image everywhere can create a sense of being constantly watched, reinforcing the regime's control and discouraging dissent. Think of 1984 by George Orwell. In some cases, displaying the leader's image may also be a way for individuals or businesses to demonstrate their loyalty to the regime and to avoid potential repercussions. In the Star Wars universe, images of Emperor Palpatine weren't exactly plastered everywhere. However, the Empire became an entity unto itself in his place, which was fulfilled through iconography to establish authority, control, and the regime ideology so as to keep civilians in line and the authoritarian machine running. The Empire positioned identifiable forces in many key places, as well as having the imperial icon plastered everywhere. It was displayed on anything from banners and HoloNet media shows to printed currency, and even being stamped directly upon processed bars of Mandalorian Beskar. You'd be hard-pressed to escape the presence of the Imperial Empire. Even though the Imperial resources were stretched thin, those in positions to make decisions made sure that the iconography of the Empire covered as many corners of the galaxy as they could. In a sense, you can imagine how you might see your country's flag hanging or displayed within eyeshot at most times, or how a sense of nationalism is established in every individual from a young age, like reciting a Pledge of Allegiance. The Imperial Empire had a program called the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, abbreviated to COMPNOR, which was a government agency responsible for the promotion of the Galactic Empire's New Order ideology. Over the course of Palpatine's reign, COMPNOR served as a political tool for the dissemination of state-sponsored propaganda throughout the Empire. In addition, COMPNOR was also an umbrella organization that consisted of multiple subdivisions, such as the Coalition for Progress and the Sub-Adult Group, also known as the SA Group. Kempshall phrased this well, so here's what the book Rise and Fall says. The SA Group was empowered with influencing the education, motivation, recreation, and recruitment of children across the Empire. Because the indoctrination of those too young to remember the Republic was considered crucial to the Empire's long-term survival, SA Group was truly vast in size and had offshoots in almost every star system within the Imperial space via the sector SA Group subdivisions under its control. the SA group set baseline standards and curriculums for education across the galaxy to ensure that children, often specifically human children, would absorb approved lessons, histories, and understandings about the galaxy. Outside of school, they would interact with approved sporting activities while also being covertly prepared for service to the Empire through prescribed loyalty programs. The emergence of the now infamous Imperial Kinderblocks on some worlds, which served as both housing and educational compounds where the Empire could raise a new generation of loyalists, is a further sign of the insidious nature of the overarching project. In certain ways, SA Group mirrors 1930s Germany and the Nazi youth program, which indoctrinated children in nationalistic ways. Prescriptive conditioning may not always show itself in such overt ways, though. In modernity, we see a certain type of prescription through certain homeschooling curriculum and educational programs such as PragerU. You could also make an argument about passive conditioning, like how the idea that plastics are recyclable and a good way to help the environment was fabricated and still perpetuated by big oil and gas companies. Or perhaps you may have taken notice that many religious circles revere Jesus as a Messiah-like figure, yet you may be hard-pressed to hear the red letters actually preached. There can be a tendency to believe that the loyalty of citizens is maintained by force or coercion. However, this is not entirely accurate. In the Galactic Empire, at least, this wasn't always the case. Rise and Fall phrases it this way. While many of the controls and propaganda attempts instituted by the Empire were designed to foster ongoing support and acceptance of imperial rule. One of the most difficult aspects of understanding the imperial state is acknowledging that much of its popular support appears to have been organically achieved. Another way that support was organically achieved was through journalism and the specific narrative the news told. Journalists would act as the face and the voice of Palpatine's regime, with intentional visions of the Empire as both a peaceful and stable state, while, contradictorily, reporting of perpetual threats from separatists, extremists, and rebel terrorists. Threats that always seemed to be in a vacuum, and that they were out to get you, the average citizen. These reports of a threat always existed in the fringes of the galaxy. The unfolding atrocities and genocides would be twisted with a positive coverage. A certain level of mental gymnastics was required to have these two aspects exist in cooperation. The idea that the Empire established peace, yet the idea that they were always at perpetual war. Those who have been closely following what has been going on in Palestine may see some correlations to what I just described with the Empire. Imperial journalists broadcasted from war-torn locations to explain why Imperial military action was necessary to maintain the safety of civilians back home. The Empire used insurgents and rebellious activity backed by general support to justify to the Senate why they needed to increase funding for military presences. And like that, the industrial military complex continues to function in full force. Long before the rebellion ever took root, wars had been coerced and fabricated for years, all while war crimes and genocides became increasingly commonplace and normalized. There was always an enemy. It was one of their main tools. This idea about the Empire needing an enemy in order to amass power and maintain control is well summarized with these lines in the book Star Wars: Hidden Empire by Charles Sewell. Empires need enemies. They need a justification for all of those weapons, for all of those soldiers. A reason for their subjects to be afraid, so the people will tolerate a level of control they would never otherwise allow. In order for the ongoing imperial military expansionism, the Empire would have to provide examples of threats and fears to the Senate in order to maintain funding and support. Worlds like Ryloth and Mimban were used in this way as the citizens of each world resisted the Empire's military occupation, and attempts to claim their planet's resources for themselves. An excerpt from Rise and Fall explained it this way. It provided the Empire opportunities to test out various battle strategies. Ryloth was an excellent contender for the Empire to use as a form of military laboratory, given that the enemy there showed no signs of surrendering, meaning that the fight could continue long enough for Imperial forces to test out new weapons and combat tactics. The fact that the insurgents on Ryloth were committed to violent resistance also made it easier for the Empire to justify its increasing military presence there to the Senate. Trying to gain approval for additional military expenditure was difficult when the Empire was nominally at peace. However, being able to point to the campaign on Mimban and suggest it was dragging on simply because the Empire lacked the resources to decisively win the battle was a lot more compelling argument. As a result, it seems highly plausible that instructions to ensure that the battle was drawn out for as long as necessary. This allowed the Empire to submit ongoing military requisition bills to the Senate, which would enable them to massively increase their armed forces. As for real-life comparisons, you can look no further than Gaza. Israel, with the backing and support of the West, uses Gaza as a testing ground for the latest military-grade weaponry. Since the 1940s, Palestinians have shown incredible resilience with their resistance in the face of the powerful Western hegemonic empire. Despite being forced off their lands, imprisoned, unequally treated, killed, maimed, occupied, stolen from, bombed, sexually assaulted, and genocided, they continue to fight for their homelands and their right to remain there. Because of this, Israel and America use the resistance of a few to justify increasing military presence and force in full discrimination against the whole of the population of Palestinians. If you give any thought into the repercussions of this continued military adherence, you must ask yourself how this attritional violence would impact those in the line of fire. A new acronym was created in the past couple of years called Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, which essentially means that unaccompanied children are registered as unknown, and that their entire family and relatives are dead. The organization Save the Children warns that the current conduct of hostilities in Gaza is exposing all children to extremely traumatic episodes, while stripping away options to help them cope. These children are experiencing signs and symptoms of trauma, including anxiety, fear, worry about their safety and that of their loved ones, night terrors, and disturbing memories, insomnia, bottling up emotions, and withdrawing from loved ones. The trauma giving rise to these symptoms is ongoing, relentless, and compounds every day. Israel has essentially created ripe conditions for future willing resistance fighters, and that is exactly what they and the weapons companies want. In Star Wars, you can only imagine how this mirrors that which happened on Ryloth and Mimban. Wars of attrition for the bolstering of the Empire, creating a never-ending cycle of justifications for death and despair. And due to journalists and their creative storytelling, many citizens continue to support or passively agree with the Empire's actions. It is funny, though, how nobody called Luke Skywalker a terrorist when he immediately joined an armed resistance movement after an occupational military force murdered his aunt and uncle and burned his home to the ground. Somehow we understood. Even addressing the propaganda side of the plight of the Palestinian peoples, journalists connected to the Western powers will routinely soft-sell a positive spin or even downplay the atrocities and genocide happening, whilst demonizing protesters and individuals calling out the powers that be. Even now in America, politicians are being lobbied to pass legislation that will further criminalize protests and the boycotts against a country not their own. Project Esther is the Heritage Foundation's plan to destroy the pro-Palestinian movement in the US. It is called the strategy to fight anti-Semitism, but in reality, it equates any criticism of Israel with terrorism. The goal is to deport, defund, sue, fire, expel, and cancel anyone who challenges Israeli policies. I would suggest reading Martin Niemöller's poem, First They Came, which criticizes complacency and disregard for social justice in speaking out. Western civilization prides itself on its technology and progress, yet the genocide in Palestine, like the ongoing atrocities in Sudan, the exploitation of workers in Congo, attacks on Yemen, immigrants, all reveal that they still wholeheartedly believe in human sacrifice. Once you decide that a group more vulnerable than you can be sacrificed in the name of your own safety or interest, you have already entered into a tacit agreement that you can also be sacrificed in the interests of a group less vulnerable than you. And so, we must ask ourselves who we are and what we stand for. The Empire requires obedience to thrive and survive. It doesn't need monsters or ideological believers. It needs you to be in the comfort of complicity and complacency, to remain silent. The series Andor shows us what happens when the proper questions are asked, but it's already too late. Tyranny doesn't spring out of a void as if it's a monolith. It escalates until it reaches a tipping point, and it watches who will rise to stop it, or doesn't. Some will join the rebellion, and others will adjust their uniforms. In the book Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, he talks about an evil that is rationalized and normalized. Atrocities occur in the brutalizing context of war, but the men who carry out atrocity by policy are in a different state of mind. They act not out of frenzy, bitterness, or frustration, but with calculation. He goes on to talk about how the system selects and rewards behaviors that benefit the authoritarian personality. A list of the crucial traits tested by the so-called F-scale of the authoritarian personality are a rigid adherence to the conventional values, submissiveness to authority figures, aggressiveness towards outgroups, opposition to introspection, reflection, and creativity, a tendency to superstition and stereotyping, preoccupation with power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, projectivity, and an exaggerated concern with sexuality. They concluded that the anti-democratic individual harbors strong underlying aggressive impulses, and fascist movements allow him to project this aggression through sanctioned violence against ideologically targeted outgroups. An army psychologist, Captain G.M. Gilbert, who was assigned to watching the defendants of the Nazi regime at the Nuremberg trials, said this: "In my work with the defendants at the Nuremberg trials 1945 to 1949, I was searching for the nature of evil, and I now think I have come close to defining it. A lack of empathy. It's the one characteristic that connects all the defendants, a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow men. Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy." The series Andor does a great job exploring the different levels of empathetic depravity within the ranks of the Empire. There are those like Cyril Karn, who falls into the Empire grasping for meaning, validation, and control. He wants order. He wants to matter. He just wants to prove himself. He's just doing his job. Cyril is then beautifully contrasted with Dedra Meero, who is cold, calculated, and void of much of her empathy. Even when confronted by Cyril about the Gorman massacre and the secret industrial colonialism project, she couldn't compute what he was saying, as she had integrated her whole self-identity into her job that she left no room to think of others. She simply didn't know a life other than to obey. George Orwell once said, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." Most of the individuals in the ranks of the Empire don't lead with cruelty. They conform through careerism, passivity, or blind duty. Or sometimes they just file paperwork. Ashton Sherritt, host of the Space Opera Music podcast, talks about a concept called the social narkina. In Andor Season 1, Cassian Andor is kidnapped and imprisoned on the water moon Narkina 5. The Empire maintained a prison complex over the oceans on this moon. Ashton goes on to explain what is meant by the social narkina. Every system that rewards silence, punishes dissent, and pressures conformity builds its own kind of narkina. Authoritarianism requires banality. It asks for your silence, then your service. Technocrats build the system. Oligarchs profit from it. You just keep working the floor. This is what authoritarianism builds. A social and even economic narkina. They want silence, efficiency, control. We must refuse to abdicate our duty to each other and see the truth for what it is before us. If you've never asked yourself what you would do, or won't do, what you won't allow yourself to support or look away from, where your allegiance is, now is a good time to do so. Thanks again for listening. If you like this episode, be sure to stick around for the next one. This is only part 2 in my Star Wars trilogy episodes. Next week will be about resistance against the Empire. If you enjoy this content, share this with a friend who also likes Star Wars. And I'd really appreciate it if you rated and reviewed this episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you can. The music used in this episode is copyright free. A big thank you to Louise Humanoid for making his music available. Check him out on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay curious, keep an open mind, and may the Force be with you, always.